Welcome back, everybody, to another Monday After Action Review. My name is Tyler. I get to serve as the associate pastor at Family of God and St. Stephen in Southwest Detroit, alongside my dear brother, Pastor Jim Hill, our senior pastor, Pastor Tim, who's our associate pastor of street ministry, and then we've got a plethora of deacons. God's really blessed us. Deacon Paul, Deacon Ron, Deacon Pat, Deacon John, Deaconess Terry. And then that's not even including all of the regular volunteers that are coming down here. So I get to stand up or to talk to you as a representative of all of them and the ministry that God does through all of us. And so I'm grateful that I get to do this with you, and it's a joy for me. I also bring greetings from soon to be Pastor Nick, and I want to get that right out of the way. If you missed it a couple of days ago, last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, I posted on the Facebook page a little picture, and it had Nick's picture on it, and it was an invite to his ordination. Nick is going to be ordained into the Office of Holy Ministry on Saturday, June 24th. 24th? I think it's 24th. 24th. At 3 o'clock at St. Peter in East Point, and I'd really encourage you all, if you haven't been to an ordination, to go ahead and do that. I think they're super fun. Plus, it's an opportunity to give Nick your support, and I know that he's excited to be a part of the ministry here at Family of God. Him and Pauline, his awesome wife, they're going to be hopefully moving up here in the next couple of weeks. So that's ordination for him. Pastor Hill and I will be there, along with a lot of other of our pastors that support the ministry. And then he will actually be installed officially into the Family of God and St. Stephen family on Sunday, July 9th at our 10:30 worship service there. So if you can't make one, go to the other. We'd really love to have all of you there. We're just trying to make sure that Nick knows that he's welcomed. And all of you, even if you've never met us, or I don't know what happens out there in listener land and out there. But anyway, a lot of you that watch this, that follow us, you're very invested in the ministry, and this is an opportunity to show that you are excited for Nick too. And he's going to be a vital part of where we think that God is taking the ministry. So we're going to be talking today about discipleship. And so one of the things that I was thinking about is that, we're in the season of Pentecost, right? The colors changed to green. And I joked this morning with St. Stephen. I was like, I really don't like Pentecost only because I have to wear a white a white alb with a green stole. And clearly, as you can see by my garage, I am not. Green and white is not a good color for me. So I say that in jest, but Pentecost is actually an interesting season of the church. It's one of those that kind of gets lost. And I think the importance of it is actually really cool because we actually shift focus. We don't shift focus away from Jesus because everything comes down to Jesus, but you actually get a little bit more of a sense of what the Holy Spirit is doing in and through the people that Jesus has called. And so you see that today in the text that we read yesterday. I'm recording this on Sunday night, but you'll be seeing this in the morning. But the text from this previous Sunday is the calling of Matthew. And so I forgot to bring it up, so I'm going to lean forward here, excuse my reach, and pull that up for us because this is it's a really good thing for us to remember and kind of just as we contemplate what is discipleship, what does it look like, and there's a couple things that I just want to share with you pertaining to discipleship. And so the first thing that I want you to consider is what is it that makes a disciple, and then what is included in that. But then where does Jesus meet us in that? And so the sermon that I preached yesterday from at St. Stephen and at Family of God was actually a combination of a sermon from Pastor Hill. He inspired parts of it for sure. I have a book of Pastor Hill's old sermons that I like to go through and just kind of see what kind of a preacher was Pastor Hill, 15 years ago, and so that's always fun. But then some inspiring points from an old professor of mine, and so especially when you consider this particular story. So the gospel text for today actually was from Matthew chapter 9, right? Matthew chapter 9, and this is the calling of said Matthew. So we don't really know that much about Matthew. We know that he was a tax collector. We know that he goes by a couple different names. We know that Matthias in Hebrew means gift of God. We know that he also went by Levi. And we know all kinds of different things like that. But we don't know too much about who he is. We know that his father's name is Alphaeus. in that he followed Jesus. But that's about it. After this particular story, we don't really hear from Matthew. He's listed in a couple lists, I think in Mark, Luke, and Acts. But other than that, there's not a whole lot else that we know about Matthew. So sometimes you have to kind of, Pastor Hill called it, what did he call it? Sanctified imagination, where you just kind of put pieces together. And one of those things that we were talking about with Matthew is, he was being a Jewish boy. He was circumcised on the 8th day, would have been presented in the temple, redeemed on the 40th day, would have had a bar mitzvah at some point, right? And grew up in the church because he's educated in Greek and in Jewish faith. So there's lots of things you can pull together. And one of the things that I was thinking about, and that Pastor Hill that we were talking about, actually, because today's sermon was actually a little more interactive. And one of the things that he brought up was, what were the parents thinking? Hey, we've got a great kid here. I really think that they can, that this Matthew could do something and can be impactful and, be a gift. That's why they named him Matthew, right? But at some point, something happened. Something changed. And I encouraged the congregation, I said, to think about it like this. The people that come to Family of God, the people that we see on a regular basis, whether they're a drug addict, whether they're an alcoholic, whether they're homeless, whether they're poor, whether they rely on other people, whether they're a woman who is getting in and out of cars so that she can make her money, whatever the case may be, I presented the congregation. I said, none of these people that come to Family of God, not a single one of them, I guarantee you, when they were in elementary school, when they did the what do you want to be when you grow up? Brandy's class just did this with her kindergarten graduation, and everyone's saying police officer, doctor, teacher. Somebody said an ice cream truck driver. Nobody raises their hand and says, I want to grow up and be a drug addict. Nobody raises their hand and says, I want to grow up and be an alcoholic. Nobody raises their hand and says, I want to sleep on the streets and eat out of dumpsters. Nobody says that. At some point, for the people that happens to, something happens in their life which causes them to pivot, whether it's trauma, whether it's a specific event, no matter what it is, and there's a lot of reasons that we could talk about, but nobody desires to be that. And so for Matthew, we can imagine that something like that happened, where that's what forced Matthew into, or not forced, but coerced Matthew into essentially to get in bed with the Romans and to want to protect his image, to be, work for the big guys, right? And to just play ball with the government forces. And so something happened, and that happened. And so anyway, so he this is where we meet him. We meet him at his lowest point as he's behind a toll booth in Capernaum, taking taxes, stealing money. And he's not a well-liked person at this point, because most Jewish people would have said, you've turned your back. You've turned your back on us. And so they don't like him. And that's where Jesus comes into play. Because Jesus, when he sees Matthew, Jesus doesn't see a man who steals. Jesus doesn't see a man who has made all kinds of tough decisions. Jesus sees a loved child of the kingdom. He sees a man who is going to be a disciple. He sees a man who is going to be a gift to the church. And so this is the story. This is Matthew chapter 9, beginning at verse 9. Again, this is Capernaum, okay? So it says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And Matthew rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when Jesus heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That comes from the Old Testament lesson today from Hosea. For I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners. And so a couple of things stick out to me as I was contemplating, again, Pastor Hill, myself, and Dr. Navsker also. Discipleship begins with a call. Discipleship begins with Jesus looking at somebody, no matter who they are, no matter what state they're in, and calling them, pointing at them, choosing them, and saying, I want you to be my disciple. Follow me, so to speak, right? And one of the things that Dr. Navsker encouraged was actually, there's a painting called The Calling of St. Matthew. I'm going to just put a little picture of it. Let's see if I can put it right here. If I can't, sorry, but if you're listening on the podcast, you won't be able to see it. But it's The Calling of St. Matthew by an Italian artist named Cavaggio. And in this painting, it's just, you can see Jesus pointing at Matthew. And Matthew has this look on his face, and he's kind of, his fingers pointing at himself, like, really, me? Like, are you sure you got the right guy? But then he's got another hand. You can kind of see his other hand kind of comes around, and he's got a hand firmly on the money as he sits at the table with all these other money changers. And it's just interesting that when you consider Jesus calling Matthew, if this picture is accurate, and who's to say that it's not, and Matthew, for a split moment, knew that following Jesus was going to mean having to give up his life of comfortability. Even if he was hated, it was comfortable, is what he knew. And so really what this means is that the call to follow Jesus, when you rise and follow Jesus as Jesus calls you to do, you can't take that stuff with you. You can't take these other things that you worship. So if you're somebody who is clinging so tight to your money, who's clinging so tight to your pride, to your reputation, and Jesus calls you out of that and says, hey, I want you to follow me, you have to let that go, because you cannot serve two gods. God will not share a place on your mantle with other gods. And so Matthew, I think, is understanding of this, and Matthew also maybe hears the promise that's kind of embedded in this when Jesus says, follow me, and then he leaves everything. Matthew doesn't respond. He doesn't push back. He just gets up and goes. And I think part of that is because he understands that, first of all, it's God that calls him, but he also understands that this God is going to take care of him, that God's going to provide for him. And he's going to lead him. And where does he lead him? After he's called, they go to Matthew's house, and Matthew desires to serve a meal. We know that it's Matthew's house in Luke's gospel. And so at this meal, there's the tax collectors and the sinners, a bunch of Matthew's buddies. And the Pharisees, of course, are there, and they've always have something to say, and they say, who is this man, and why does he associate with people like that? Why does he come down to Family of God and hang out with the addicts, they hang out with the alcoholics, hang out with the poor people? Doesn't he know who that is? And the reason this is such a scandal, this is one of the things we were talking about today as well. The reason that this is so scandalous is because it matters who's at Jesus' table, who Jesus sits with, who Matthew sits with. What you say when you dine with somebody, it's an intimate thing. And so society, it's a public proclamation that I welcome this person, that I associate with this person, that I'm going to be interacting and hanging out, that this person's okay with me. Not the sinfulness part, but that the people that society looks at as outcasts, Jesus welcomes them to their table. And the people see that, the Pharisees see that, and they raise hell about it. Because it matters who's at Jesus' table, because they're not at the table. And so what's interesting is that after the call, Jesus takes them and interacts and invites them into this meal. And I posed a question to the congregation, when Jesus calls us, if Jesus were to walk in this door right here, you guys can't see my door over there, but if Jesus were to walk in the door and say, Tyler, I want you to follow me, and I say, okay, stand up, I go, and he's going to lead me to go eat. He's going to lead me to go dine with someone, to show that intimate relationship. He's not taking me to Mount Clemens, where I live. He's not taking me to my favorite restaurants downtown. He's not taking me to Bloomfield Hills. He's not taking me to the St. Clair Shores. He's not taking me to Grosse Ile or Grosse Pointe or whatever. He's not taking us to the suburbs where the really nice restaurants are. He's not even taking me to downtown Detroit, to the Highlands, or to wherever some of these other nice, really nice, fancy restaurants are. He's going to take me to Clark Park. I really believe that. He's going to take me to the place where the unloved are. He's going to take me behind the dumpsters. He's going to take me to the Meals on Wheels trucks to eat with the people who literally rely on those things. Because that's what Jesus does. That's what the call to follow Jesus is. It's associating with sinners. It's bringing them to sit at this table with Jesus so that they can have a very real encounter with them too. And that really struck me in my sermon prep this week. And the fact that Jesus meets us, because there's another way. Jesus isn't going to come through this door, but he is going to meet. He did meet us today. I reached out and touched and consumed Jesus today, and that's in the Lord's Supper. Because Jesus doesn't just come through the door, but he makes himself present in the Lord's Supper. And at this meal, at this dining table, at the altar, the meal is not, I said the meal is not cold chicken and a dented can of green beans, which is what you might get at some of these places that serve food, drive the trucks around to the people, the homeless people and the addicts and the alcoholics. Jesus gives him himself. You get to feast on bread and wine, body and blood, all for you. Jesus has made it possible for you to sit at his table. Jesus has given everything so that you can sit at his table. So when we follow Jesus, the call to follow Jesus, it begins with the call and letting go of everything that you know, because you know that you get to eat with Jesus. You get to dine with Jesus. You get to be provided for by Jesus. And yes, Jesus is going to call you to be uncomfortable. Absolutely. He's going to call you to do some really difficult things. Pastor Hill and I were dealing with some really difficult things at the end of today. But the Lord strengthened us to do it, to not go crazy, to not get angry, but to be patient and let this guy who was in there tell his story. And it turned out that the problems were way far beyond anything that we could do. And so we were just with him. We listened to him, and he ultimately decided, because we weren't helping him in the way that he wanted to be helped, he walked out angry. But the Lord gives us the strength to deal with that, right? So Jesus leads us into dealing with people like that, to sitting with people like that, and to invite them to the feast, which is exactly what Pastor Hill and I did. We invited him to pray, to sit, to help him to get into a rehab facility, and he just wasn't having any of it. That's a choice that they make. But you can still invite somebody to that table because Jesus meets you first. And all of this comes down to the fact that the reason that Jesus calls you, the reason that Jesus makes a spot for you at the table, is because you are loved by him. Because the only fact that you are, when we were thinking, who, me, right? Like that painting of Matthew going, who, me? Really? Jesus, you want me to follow you? Don't you know what I've done? Jesus says, yes, I know exactly what you've done, but I also know what I've done for you. And so we just remember the reasons that we follow Jesus, not because it's not going to be necessarily going to be fun. It's not because it's going to be comfortable, but it's because you get to follow the God who gave his life for you, who created you and gave his life for you, promises to provide for you. And he's worthy of all of that. That's why we follow Jesus. So I just invite you to just to consider that this week. Consider your own walk with Jesus. And are you still holding on to that money bag? Are you still holding on to the things in this life that are preventing you from really, truly following Jesus in the way that Jesus has intended to? Because he wants to have that. He wants to be in your life. He wants to, I'm starting to sound like an evangelist preacher. He wants to be in your life. He wants you to sit at his table. He wants you to feast on that bread and wine. He wants you to be lavished with forgiveness. That's what being a disciple of Jesus is. It's sitting at his feet. It's following him. It's receiving the very gifts that Jesus has for you. That's where discipleship begins. Next week, we're going to be, the text is a little bit more of a focus on some other things that Jesus and the apostles did. But today is the beginning. You're called to follow Jesus. You're called to eat with Jesus because Jesus wants to associate with you, because he loves you and he's forgiven you of all of your sins. And I pray that that is an encouragement for you this week as we go into the full season of Pentecost. Have a great week, everyone. Pastor Hill and I are going to be recording a new episode of the Suffering Servants podcast. We're going to be going through a book called Without Flesh. So that's going to be a good one. And then I've got some new interviews lined up for the next couple of weeks. That'll be fun to kind of go into the summer with those things. So you guys are doing a great job supporting that podcast. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for all the work that you do for the ministry. I said this before. Sometimes I think that we forget how many hands are behind the scenes. We forget about how much that Deaconess Terry provides for us, how much that Deacon Paul and Deacon Pat and Deacon Ron provide for us, how many your volunteers that, if you're watching this and you've come down to serve a meal, like we say, well, we can't do what we do without you, but that is the truest thing that I think I could say to our volunteers, is that we cannot do what we do without you and your support. So thank you so much for that. So have a great week, everyone. My inbox is open if you have questions, comments, concerns. Remember that Nick's ordination, Saturday, June 24th. Look forward to seeing all of you at 3 o'clock at St. Peter East Point. So look for, I'll give an update probably about a week ahead of time just to remind everybody. And we look forward to seeing you. So have a great week, everyone. If no one's told you yet, God loves you, and so do we. I'll talk to you next time.